So we're going to talk about building resilient networks. So I did my homework. I looked at the dictionary, and resilience means, by Merriam-Webster Dictionary, the ability of something to return to its original shape after it has been pulled, stretched, pressed, bent, etc. So it's basically being elastic, right? And you started Aave, Lens, and you're running those acquired businesses like Go with an H, and Family, Sonar. How come you came up with this idea of resilience?
Yeah, I mean, we can even think about that's a really nice definition what resilience is, and I think a lot in this space we always tune into and lay out foundations around decentralization. And I think decentralization is a very loaded word because it means different things to different people. For some, it means having enough users or community members to govern a public good. For some, it means that there's less single point of failures. For some, it means that if you don't agree with decisions, you can actually fork a system and create a new community around that. And then there is like a bunch of people online finding what's decentralization, and there is another group of people that then are fighting what is sufficient decentralization. And I think it's really hard to really point down what is the purpose of that discussion because it has so many vectors. And what I think why resiliency is much better kind of a value and principle to build upon is because a resilient system is easier to recognize. So when I started building earlier Aave and back in the ETHLAN days, I was trying to figure out how to build a system that works by itself. And that was the promise of Ethereum and this blockchain technology, is that you can create something and deploy it, and it can, in best case scenario, it can live forever. So you can create these unstoppable forever applications. And now more that time passes and the space is growing, and we see, for example, DeFi growing, there's a less actually focus on making widely decentralized system. It's more about resiliency. So how do we create financial systems, social networks, or any other types of functions in a way that there is least amount of failure points, single point of failure. And that includes, let's say, the protocol architecture, resiliency against the founding teams, founders, investors, and governments, fake news, any type of thing that disturbs the main function of a use case, essentially. And that's why it's important. And when you build social networking, what I realize is that if you think about decentralization, it's going to be hard to build upon because decentralization has a cost. So if anyone is familiar with the whole blockchain trilemma, scalability, decentralization, and security, you can't really have everything together at once. So you have to compromise. So when we think about social and consumer applications, you have to a little bit compromise, or not even compromise, but you have to apply the right amount of security to make a system resilient. And what we have, for example, with, let's say, L1s and L2s, they provide certain amount of security with, let's say, rollups with a lower transaction cost, but that's not enough, for example, building something where the application layer will be consumer and with hundreds of millions of transactions. So it's kind of choosing a trade-off or right amount of application into making a system that is resilient enough of these different types of threats.
From what I understand, is a resilient approach could be it could be described as when the rights, like freedom of speeches or the content moderation are pulled in opposing directions, we should be able to maintain the right status and the spectrum of those rights. Am I getting it right?
I think so. I mean, the first question that people ask usually is that if people have free speech, how do you solve moderation and whatnot? And I think we do, for example, have free speech in real life, and obviously that is still arguably limited in some cases, and free speech doesn't necessarily mean that you can say things that are legal or creates some sort of illegal actions or consequences from that. But essentially what I even like to use is not the word free speech, because it's such another word that is essentially like politically loaded, but voice. So everyone has a voice today. So like we, in this event, we can talk to people, we can meet everyone, and we can express things, so we can say things out loud. But if you think about the digital world and how it's built today and social networks, that voice that you have can actually be taken away from you. So what I'm trying to figure out is that how do we build infrastructure over online where you can have an identity and you can have that voice, and essentially there's nothing that can actually take that voice away from you. And then if you think about moderation and effectively the reach, how your message should reach, that is more of like an application layer problem to solve. So everyone on a network layer should have a voice, and you should be able to communicate with everyone the way you want to. So that's the kind of like a resiliency part. And then the moderation part is something that can be built on the application layer. And then that also gives users more power and more choice, because as a user, you can choose the right communities, the right moderation, the right discovery, and you're not really boxed into one application where you can't really leave because you leave all your social capital behind into that application and a platform. So they kind of are, it is a gravity that has opposing forces, but I think one side belongs to the actually resiliency layer, and the other side belongs into the application and discovery layer, where you can solve that moderation problem.
I want to come back to the decentralized part, because I thought by nature, being decentralized can be resilient, because even when there's a flaw in a single node, we can hold the security of the whole network with the remaining nodes. Am I wrong about this?
Well, I think the decentralization aspect is definitely the foundation. So the reasons we're building, for example, Lens on-chain and using the blockchain is because it's the main technology that actually can provide data integrity. And there's data integrity because there's a thing called consensus. So there's some sort of a way for all these nodes to reach an agreement what is right and wrong. So when you have ability to have a consensus over data, then the next step is just replicate that data with as many hubs as possible, like nodes as possible. And when you compare, for example, other alternatives with the typical like client-server model, obviously you don't have that resiliency. With federated models, you kind of think you have resiliency, but you kind of end up in a system where these federated hubs become actually growing data hubs and essentially data dictatorships. So there's basically no way to ensure that a federated server upholds the data if there is no consensus. Because one of the beauties of the blockchain is that if one node leaves the system, another node comes back, and there's incentives to uphold the network, and that's the resiliency. That's proven for Ethereum with the uptimes and without being able to be broken over the years, essentially. But I think the key component is that how much of that decentralization you need to apply to specific use cases. Now, with DeFi, we learned quite well that it's a financial infrastructure. DeFi is going to be the whole backbone of all financial transactions at some point. It has to be resilient. It has to be very resilient. So using high security there makes sense. But then you have other types of capital, like social capital, which is different from financial capital, where it's what we create as identities online all the time. It's the connections we make online. It's the content we create and the content we distribute to our audiences. So we all have social capital. It's not really valued because the ownership isn't given to us as users at the moment. So back to that decentralization aspect is that we don't need to look into building the most decentralized social network. We need to look into how we build the most resilient social network, that it's still scalable. And going back to that blockchain trilemma challenge, you can't have scale, decentralization, and security at the same time, but you need to know how much of each ingredient you have to apply. So DeFi, you have to apply a lot of security. You might have a lot of decentralization and maybe very little scalability. Payments that can be built on top of this existing DeFi infrastructure, maybe there you need more scalability, maybe less security. And then when we look into consumer and social applications and use cases, you need enough security that you can establish ownership, which is essentially owning your identity, your connections, and the networks and distribution that you have on chain, that no one can take that away from you. And it's essentially a public good that everyone can build applications and endpoints and expand your experience. So I think it's a more of like moving out of that like light switch approach of using the blockchain into kind of like tuning in enough like decentralization volume that we get the resiliency that we need, but we achieve the scalability of getting social into the mainstream. And I do think that while DeFi is the product market fit now on chain, it's going to take a decade to actually take adoption. And social is something where we can move much more faster and bring much more quicker and more users into the space.
But still, Lens wants to become a large and great social media, I guess. And on its website, it says, an open social network where users own their content and connections, so, which is basically a social media. But I think you have to still compete against those social media giants. I don't have to mention their names, but what's your strategy on that fight?
I think everything we do in this space, we're always competing against the big giants. Because end of the day, we're recreating the internet. So we're building for an audience and an infrastructure that kind of like already exists. And a lot of these bigger social networks, they were created when internet became more usable. You had enough bandwidth to actually load pictures instead of just text. You have more bandwidth to actually upload and download and watch and stream videos. And this infrastructure is built. Obviously, the whole original idea of the internet was to build a decentralized network that provides access to everyone and provides some guarantees of accessibility, even ownership. But because of the usability challenge, what happened actually is that we built an internet where we have mostly a handful of companies owning most of the data, owning most of the platform monetizations, and essentially it's really hard to compete with those networks. And it's only going to get more difficult because the more data these companies have, the better machine learning algorithms they can create, the more actually power they can take away from users, which is basically us. And building something that gives more power to the users you'll always go against the big platforms. The same is happening with decentralized finance. The whole idea in the beginning was to actually make this infrastructure to actually build better financial infrastructure. And 7 years later, we now have actually financial institutions that are interested in DeFi. So we have BlackRock, we have credit institutions. So they're actually joining the movement. And I think the same thing will happen with social, is that decentralized social networks, or let's say resilient social networks, they're going to gain momentum amongst their communities. They are going to empower a lot of users, and those who are going to be early, they're going to benefit the most. But at some point, this technology will just go into adoption into the bigger platforms as well. And then the question is there, how do we ensure actually that the application of that technology is correct? And we have the same problem in DeFi with central bank digital currencies, where we want to use the blockchain, but we want to still hold all the keys and control over the value and the infrastructure. So this battle will be going on for as long as we have this kind of like a disparity going on.
But at the same time, the blockchain technology is advancing extremely fast. And it is very apt to, very sensitive to the trends. And what do you think what kind of technologies are crucial in order to achieve that resilient social networks, do you think?
Well, on-chain is just one part of social networking. On-chain is something that enables access control, and access control enables ownership. And everyone probably here is already an owner. So you own a particular asset. It might be ETH or it might be a stable coin. But the ownership can be also owning a piece of identity, a piece of a network of your friends and your followers, or it can be an ownership of actually writing into a collaborative newsletter. So there's a lot of ownership surface available that we can build in social networking, in consumer and media. And then obviously the second piece of it is actually the media piece. And a lot of the media is obviously today stored in centralized databases, but that can be stored in decentralized systems, decentralized storage. IPFS is a really great piece of technology, and a lot of, for example, NFT metadata, a lot of metadata is stored on IPFS today. The challenge is obviously is that we need to make these technologies also compatible with the types of everyday usage that we have. For example, we should be able to remove data from IPFS and have more control over it. Because end of the day, people want to remove things maybe that they posted online a few years ago. So on-chain part is for ownership. Decentralized storage that is mutable is for that kind of like media storage aspect. And then when you put these two pieces together, from developers' perspective, you can actually then build very interesting algorithms. Because what Lens is actually trying to also do from developers' perspective is to actually democratize the access to compute and build algorithms and build better discovery. And that creates more competition and I would say even arms race to build algorithms that users really want. And the switch cost is extremely low. And I think that's going to be really important.
All right. Our time is almost up, but I should ask this final question. Lens is now evolving into a Lens network. How can the existing Lens protocol fit into this new network? Can you answer it shortly, maybe? Yeah.
We think that Lens, we don't talk much about the network because the network is just an infrastructure to make extremely cheap transactions. And I think a lot of the scaling technology has evolved into layer 2s with rollups, but that's just not enough for social and consumer transactions. So the big problem is that if you want to put scale and do a lot of transactioning, the rollups will not be in a price point that is acceptable for consumers. Consumers will not want to pay for transaction costs. No one is going to go to the internet and pay for every single click or every single domain they're writing. we're still living in a phase where you had to pay for every text message you're sending. So that's where like the blockchain is today. Lens network is simply removing that. It's going to make blockchain free. And what it means is that it's so inexpensive because of the architecture of using so-called Validium, which is utilizing Ethereum with a data availability layer. And that means that the transaction costs are so low that developers, they don't want to pass these transaction costs back to the end user. The same way, for example, if you're using internet application today, developers aren't passing their AWS or any other like domain costs for the end users. That's how we should build Web3 today. And the Lens network is essentially just enabling that simple concept of making blockchain free to use for the end users. And then the Lens protocol itself is something where we take all these social networking features and put them on chain where ownership is relevant. And that might be, for example, creating social graphs, and that can be a global, application-specific, creating, for example, feeds, creating usernames for applications, or joining the kind of like a global namespace, or creating on-chain communities. So what we're doing essentially with the Lens protocol is we are enabling a lot of ownership over social and giving the power back to the users. And the network itself is just a piece of infrastructure that makes it really affordable and scalable for mainstream. And all this we're going to launch in the next couple of months. So it's going to be really busy for us.